And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
How are you doing? I'm
Oh,
oh, I'm getting a
oh,
message that this meeting is being live streamed.
uh, nice. Everyone, welcome to Dark Ozarks. It is mm, technically, I believe the 21st will be the first
Mhm.
day of summer. We'll experience the summer solstice. That would be Sunday, and yet, perhaps not unsurprisingly, summer came quite early here in the Ozarks.
Yes, it did. We're verging on 100 degrees, and I feel like a roasted marshmallow. So
I believe I have melted and then been reconstituted several times this week,
I think that's fair.
particularly at farmers market, and um, perhaps an aside, but of course this Saturday will be Writers Artist Night, and I just found out that you all are going to be down there. I'm very excited about that.
Yes. I with all the double duties going on right now with these projects, I did not get my submission in this year, but we are going to be there.
I'm so glad. For me, of course, there's a lot of moving parts on this particular event. But for me, the best part is just getting to see so many good friends.
Yes, it's a good time, and I would encourage anyone that's in the area to come out Saturday night and listen to some good stories and poetry.
Absolutely. We've got a really interesting lineup, and I guess time, date, place 6 p.m. at the Chad A. Fuqua City Park in downtown Hollister. That would be 312 Esplanade Drive, Hollister, Missouri, 65672, if you're Googling it. And we'll be there. The event will run 6 to 10 p.m. It's free, open to the public. Everyone is invited. And 25 writer artist pairs, or pairings. So we're dealing with about 50 different pieces being presented over the course of the evening, of both original written work and original art. All of it done by Ozarks artists and Ozarks writers, and that is the commonality. And the cool thing that I've always enjoyed is that it is not it's not specifically, it does not have to be Ozarky to be included in the event.
Wide range of subjects.
Yes, sometimes very angsty, always fun.
Not touching
this is
that
this is a bit of a jump over, but you've participated multiple times
one. Mhm.
in this event. One of the very memorable pieces is not Dead Ringer, which was a recent submission, um, is awesome, along with art by Steffi Blevins. But
Mhm.
one of the pieces not long ago, it's on the State of the Ozarks, is a piece that was inspired, I believe, at the Kendrick House. Is that right?
Yes. Allegiances, yes.
I really like that piece. Lacey Fincham did a really fascinating and fun take on that. For
Mhm.
people who don't know, you all as writers, Lisa and many other writers, submit pieces. Then I share those pieces with artists who then create original art inspired in some way by the written word. So then it's highly collaborative. And this is only tenuously related to our topic tonight, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the Allegiances story. Of course, it has a direct correlation with the Spring River and
Yes.
the Kendrick House. So tell me a little bit about that story.
Well, it's actually based on an event that did happen during the Civil War, um, and real people. Basically, you had the Kendrick family who uh, were large landowners. They were gunsmiths and blacksmiths, and so valuable to both sides. Although uh, they were tried to uh, be burned out by both sides at different times. Um, but the Union at one point decided they were trying to clear out all Confederate sympathizers, and one of the Kendrick sons, well, actually several sons had served in the Confederate Army. 3 of them had died. 1 of them was still living. They come to the home and are interrogating the elderly Mr. Kendrick, who's in his 70s and quite deaf. And while this is going on, one of the young slave girls who the family was raising after her mother was killed in the war is hiding with the children under the house. And it plays out what happened often in the Ozarks is that neighbors were on opposite sides. So while you have one officer threatening to kill Mr. Kendrick and coming very close to doing so, another officer realizes where the children, including the slave girl, are hiding, and recognize it. They recognize each other, and he protects them.
Wow.
And so, there are some artistic liberties with the narrative, but it's based on a true event. And the house did supposedly have a tunnel from under the house to the river for escape if need be.
Yes. Now tell me about the river up there. I've seen it.
Yeah. Well, the river is actually goes a very long way. I don't know what the total length of Spring River is, and then there's a northern branch, but it goes through several counties. And it literally is a few hundred yards from the house, and main approach into town from the military road, as well as the trail west for settlers heading out of Springfield.
There's, now if memory serves, of course I've been out to the Kendrick house several times. If you're on the big road south of town, you just kind of have the big modern bridge there. But if you're at the Kendrick house and you take the smaller road, there's to me a really, really awesome bridge.
The 3 bridges in one. Yeah.
Yes, I love that old bridge, and I love that. And I may be wrong about this, but it feels like the Spring River in that space, that there's a lot of marsh, or a lot of timber and marsh that you're going over. Is that right?
Yes, actually, and it spreads out, and there are at different places. There are small islands in the channel. Very nearby, Center Creek, which is actually a river as well, runs through there, and it's very much the same way. And in fact, during one of the Civil War battles, they lost a cannon in one of the rivers. So
that would be fair, because it's very thick.
Yes, and to be honest, I'm sure it was more so then, and there were no bridges across it at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course, our topic for tonight is mystical waters.
Yes.
I'm very, very excited about this. Water in this sense, to me, is mystical. It has a very magical quality to it. The waterways of the northwestern portions of the Ozarks shares a lot, I think, is akin to, shares a lot of similarities with some of the waterways in Kansas and Oklahoma, as well as the Ozarks. It's a very unique space, something that is, to me, is both very interesting. There seems to be contradictory water lore, in the sense that some lore suggests that certain spirits cannot cross flowing water.
True.
And in other cases, that there are spirits such as water horses that are in the water,
Mhm.
sometimes with considerable risk, and associated with that. And then, of course, marsh areas have entirely their own lore, will o' the wisp type lore in that regard. So what just with some of those elements and then other elements as well, what's some of your thoughts in terms of water lore?
Water lore, at least in the west, in the western Ozarks, I think a lot of the water lore that you're going to hear from locals has to do with underground spaces, underground lakes, underground rivers, um, and sort of just that sense of mystery and exploration, people getting lost. Um, it's very evocative of even the River Styx when you think about some of these tales. And um, I mean, a lot of there's a number of towns in the area that they have so many rivers and caves under them that they literally just try to do everything they can to cordon them off because people get down there. And then, of course, we have no idea what's been put down there, dumped down there over the last 150 years.
Yeah.
And so you get a lot of a sense of awe, but danger,
Hmm.
warning, don't go there. Um, and what I find interesting is, I would say more in say the last 20 years, more reluctance to talk about it. When I was growing up, these places were very, I mean, it was a very open subject. And you went and you looked for sinkholes, and of course around here you had mine shafts everywhere. Everyone, you know where to find them. And but anymore, people seem to be more reluctant to talk about it. And I don't know whether it's because we have a lot of newcomers that have moved into the Ozarks. Um, I don't know. I'm not sure what the reason for that is, but I find that interesting.
I I do as well. Something that was brought to mind a bit is we were talking about that, actually in regards to Springfield, Fast Night Creek,
Hmm.
and the sometimes necessary but certainly interesting urban planning. A good chunk of Fast Night Creek is a cement edged canal.
Yes,
And I think, in comparison, when you think creeks in the Ozarks, that is obviously the last thing that you would be thinking of.
it's true. Another place that you made me think of saying that is just in the southern end of Bates County, um, north of Nevada, but before you get to Butler. You
Yes.
go over if you're on I-49 or still US 70, well, it's going to be 71 for most people forever, but um, you will go over a waterway that has been cemented in places, but and they just call it the South Bates County Drainage Ditch.
Well, it is an appropriately evocative name. Uh,
I thought I don't know if New Englanders came in and settled or what, because it's a very practical, almost Quaker sounding.
yes, it is. Yes,
Yeah,
it is.
that's what it is.
Suggested that it might be the least mystical of the Ozarks waters. But
Now I don't know if there's a North Bates County Drainage Ditch, but
oh, that is fun. I'm oh, something you mentioned, River Styx, that triggered something we talked about on Instagram. Devil's Den or Devil's Well.
yeah,
If there's a location in the Ozarks that could potentially be the way into the River Styx, I think it could be Devil's Well, on the current river, or near the current river in Shannon County, Missouri.
Mhm.
It's
I can see that.
I
Um, I definitely
it's
could.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I said I definitely could, yeah.
There's, of course, I guess so. So for people who might not be familiar, the bulk, not the entirety, but the bulk of the Ozarks Plateau is karst limestone. It's a bed of limestone that responds well to water, and consequently, there's a really just a impossible to fully quantify network, almost like a web of arteries or veins through a human body, a network of an artery system of waterways that course through the limestone rock
Mhm.
upon which the Ozarks are. And so it the the karst allows for just this network of waterways that are also caves.
Mhm.
And it's an interesting process in the sense, or interesting process to understand, that in the sense, you have your creeks and your rivers, and your creeks and your rivers in some cases can disappear into that network underground. It becomes, what we colloquially refer to as a lost river,
Mhm.
which inspired the old ride at Silver Dollar City that's no longer there. But then when that lost river at some point may empty um, back into, onto land, is the definition of a spring.
Mhm. And both in the New World and the Old World, they have uh, a lot of special meaning. Aside
Yes.
aside from the practical fact of making life a lot more easy, but um, as you were talking too, as talking about the lost rivers and river Styx, um, it makes me think of an area near Carthage that with the underground, it was a quarry. Now
Yes.
it's commercial storage underground. Some of it, it's vast. Some of it is more finished out than other areas, and the further you go back, and literally, you could walk miles in there. Um, but in the furthest recesses, you will get to the point where you hear the lost river, you hear the river roaring, and
Mm.
depending on how, how high the water table is from rains and so forth, you can get to it and the water rushing by, and people describe it as being, like the Snake River, wild rapids, wild, fast running water. There have been times in really rainy years that the ground above in that area will just stand wet,
Mm.
saturated. And I've always just thought of, if the river Styx. I mean that, and people say you can't see the other side even. So,
I want to go see it.
well, you have to sneak in typically. So if
Okay.
you don't work there, so that may be a
Oh,
problem.
that's so neat, though. And, this is an above ground comparison, but Greer Spring,
Hmm.
I believe, empties into the 11 Point. Um,
I think it's 11 point. Yeah.
I think it's been a while since I was over there. There's several things that I find really fascinating. So, experience with Greer Spring. First of all, the Greer Spring Mill um, is on top of the mountain. You normally think of mills being right next to the water, the old water
Mhm.
mills. Greer Spring, big old barn of a mill, on top of the mountain, and still there. Certainly was there in 2009, 2010. I believe it's still there, and built in the late 19th century, early 20th. And they built a series of cable and pulley mechanism that traipsed its way all the way down the mountain
Oh, wow.
to the spring. So incredible. I know it's not technically steampunk, but it certainly feels like it. And then the hike down to Greer Spring is lengthy. It's a state park or a state conservation area. It is a lengthy hike, again, down the mountain.
Yeah.
And from is a geological element that particular mountainside includes a lot of eroded dolomite. And dolomite is interesting in that it erodes in cubes,
Yeah.
rather than small pieces. And so as you're going down the side of the mountain, you start noticing these enormous square blocks of stone that, if you did not know better, you would be like, there had to have been a castle here.
Yeah.
And it's naturally occurring, but it certainly doesn't look like it. It is very enchanted. To me, it's there's something about passage over water or passage through wilderness, that, especially if the wilderness contains some sort of surreal element that separates, again, the journey itself becomes a liminal space. It changes your perception, and of course it really helps through that changed perspective, or through that traversing of liminal space, if what you arrive at is also magical, as opposed to, say, like a suburban development, then it would be very disheartening. And in this case, where you arrive is Greer's Spring, which is magical. Both, well, not both, I mean, many traditionalist ancient cultures regarded springs as sacred liminal spaces. The Celts had an enormous amount of water lore, of the magic of the spring, the magic of the water. We know that many of the Ozarks springs, Blue Spring comes to mind, also near in the Shannon County area, but were regarded by First Nation or Native Americans, the Osage and the Caddo, as deeply sacred places. And Greer Spring, to give people an idea, at the point that Greer Spring empties into the 11 Point River, it doubles the size of the river.
Yeah. I mean, huge capacity.
It is, and to watch that water, boil, as it comes out of that hole, is a sacred experience.
Well, not nearly as big, but Big Spring in Neosho is much that way. It's and I always joke, Neosho is just built on. It's kind of like Rome. It's just a bunch of hills and valleys. But I think there's probably more than 7 hills, and it doesn't take much rain before streets are flooded and you can't get through. And right in the middle of town is Big Spring Park, and the spring comes out of this bluff, and it's very pretty because the bluff is probably 50 feet high, and you've got the bluff goes on around past the park and around, and you have all of these Italianate homes from the turn of the century seen on top of the bluff and so forth. But then when the water is flowing hard, it just boils out of there, and it comes out under a shelf, and so it looks like it comes from nowhere,
Yes.
and it just roars. It's basically an almost a bowl, and so it just roars. So when you're there, it's like being at Niagara Falls, but smaller and no waterfall. It
Yes.
sounds it sounds has that kind of a roar, but obviously not as loud. But
Yeah.
and just as in Europe, First Nations people often associated springs with uh, spirits, elemental spirits, um,
Yeah.
and see why. Um, and then over time, of course, as settlers came in, and everything, um, water was so important, and we had just touched on Instagram, but let's delve into water witching.
Yes. I I find water witching to be really fascinating. I guess for people who don't know, go ahead and let people know what water witching is.
Dowsing, dowsing rods, but sort of the more colloquial term is to be a water witch. You find water with
Yes.
sticks, with a forked stick, or two sticks or two rods, um, and a lot of people will dismiss it um, as, oh, it's just coincidence if someone finds it. What happens if someone's adept with it is that the rod will point to the ground, and that's where they dig and they find water close to the surface.
Yes.
And that's how they would often dig for wells.
Hmm.
Uh, and then, of course, in our 20th century uh, modernistic idea of science, we started thinking, oh, this is silly and it's coincidence. And so even well diggers and everything gave it up and started just using more geological uh, aspects to guess where they're going to hit water. And
Hmm.
interestingly, I read a few years ago that I think it was in Germany, it was in Europe. They did an extensive study trying to decide who was better at finding water, the engineers or the dowsers. And the dowsers had a good enough track record and were that much better that they were going back to using dowsing because they were saving so much money.
Yes. I there's a couple of things about it. I love the conceptual allure.
Hmm.
I love the connection to an to something unseen, but I think confirmedly there.
Yes, and actually, I think one of the best descriptions I've read was actually from Vance Randolph, which of course is one of the preeminent folklorists of the Ozarks, down at Pineville. Um, he he was talking about there was a doctor there, and I forget the doctor's name offhand. This would have been about the 20s, and he commented that this was the last person he would expect to be a
Yes.
water witch, and that he was very practical, scientific, and an atheist, and why and and uh, um, and the doctor said, yeah, he never gave it much thought, thought it was silly until someone got him to try it, and he goes, I guess I have a knack for it. And Randolph described it that the rod would just start shaking and pointing down, for him, and they would hit water. Um, and the doctor was like, I can't explain why it works, it just does. And that's pretty well, I think, accurate for most
I think
people.
it I think it is, and there was something in that account that again that you've already hit on that really really jumped out at me. But the fact that many of the individuals who can water witch, or who are, by technical definition, who are water witches, are not individuals that you would associate with this type of lore, and that, you know, that secondarily there is I there's a really, to me, a really, in this particular case, in this case, and in many other cases, particularly in regards to sort of backwoods lore, there is an interesting evocation of the word witch.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, the sense of witching or witchery, that
Yeah.
it is, it denotes the unknown. It denotes a special power that might cause trepidation, but it is not an epithet.
Yes, yes, very much so. And what I find interesting is, of course, traditionally, dowsing has been used to find water, but it's actually used for other things as well.
Yes, it
Uh,
is.
uh, Surprisingly, it was used, and this happened in Oklahoma and Texas, or in Oklahoma and Kansas quite a bit. They used it to find oil.
Interesting.
Um, and there are accounts of people using it to find different metals as well, particularly gold. And
Hmm.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. I guess with water or even oil, you'd think maybe movement or something. I don't know, much friction and so forth that maybe would affect things. I don't pretend to understand that, but
I, I don't either. I think it, to me, it has something to do with energy and residual energy that we don't have a definition for. You know, in one case I can name this person, in another case I don't have permission to, but I know two water witches.
mm-hmm,
And and interestingly enough, the one I can name is Dale.
mm-hmm. Oh, that doesn't surprise me.
Dale's been a water witch for a long time. Back in the 80s, when he worked at Silver Dollar City and they needed to find the water lines to do work, they'd get him to douse
Mm-hmm.
to run the water line. And the other, I don't have permission to name, is again, very, very down to earth, long standing, long generational family in Taney County, and he uses dowsing to locate graves for the historical
Yeah.
societies.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of leads into another thing I was going to say is that uh, now what I see a lot is it is actually used in paranormal investigations.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, and uh, and I've doused before on investigations. I've seen some things I can't really explain. I tend to uh, I tend to try to be careful because you can have sympathetic movement, of course.
Hmm.
And usually what happens in those kind of situations, instead of them pointing down, you will have usually one start spinning.
Hmm. And
And
is that with the with the metal rods?
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Hmm. And they tend to use copper rods, of course, a good conductor of energy. What I like to do is actually set the rods in wooden handles, brackets, and not be touching them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, I've had some interesting um, uh, success there, but things that you couldn't really explain.
Hmm.
So,
With paranormal research, what, obviously grave finding, but that's more historical research. What
mhm.
with paranormal research, what is some of the speculation or some of the experience that is involved with that?
Well, typically, I mean, different people use it differently, but what typically when I've seen it and when I've used it would be to try to locate an area that, particularly if you're outside, a good area to conduct an EVP session. Because if
Okay.
you're in a large area, say, um, say a battlefield or something, um, you could be all over the place, and where do you actually set up? And um, if you're getting a lot of reaction from the rods, I found that tends to be an area where you tend to get EVPs. So
Interesting. Very cool. That's so it again, it seems to be associated what we would think of as some sort of mystical energy currents.
exactly, and of course, it may be also reacting to underground water as well, which
Yeah. And we have some really interesting paranormal lore that is associated with water.
yes, you do tend to have more at. I don't know that you have more activity, but it seems to be amplified around moving water.
Hmm.
Uh, and actually, uh, one thing that doesn't seem to get in the movies a lot, you know, is that you'll have places where you will have dripping water and there's no source for it. Um,
Hmm.
there's and sometimes in places where there is no water,
Hmm.
um, and or there's been no rain or anything, and water will be raining down walls, be pooling on the floor, whatever. Um, Faucets turning on by themselves, things like
Hmm.
that.
Yes. And I believe water on the walls was one of the things that was observed actually at the Old English Inn,
Yes, yes.
which is here in Hollister.
Hmm.
That's interesting. That is very, very interesting. And of course, we have Turkey Creek.
Right, just across the just across the road.
Yeah, yeah. I get to see Turkey Creek on a regular basis. Um, coming, of course, the so again, I'm interested. I'm rather fascinated by this. There's to me there's contra. I'm not I'm not going to say that the contradictions negate the lore. I think it's many different types of lore, each with their
Mhm,
own truth. But I think most of us potentially grew up with the old Legend of Sleepy Hollow Disney cartoon animated short, uh,
mhm.
gloriously narrated by Bing Crosby, and that it was one of my
I always loved
favorite.
it.
I would watch it back. Of course, before this was before we had a VCR, and it would be shown once on CBS shortly before Halloween, and I could not wait, even though it terrified me, and I loved it. But I was genuinely scared. And of course, when Ichabod Crane is being pursued by the Headless Horseman, he's making his way for the bridge because the Headless Horseman cannot cross the bridge.
Hmm. Which of course is a play on River Styx and the fairy.
Yes. And there is an interesting amount of lore, the idea that negative spirits cannot cross flowing water.
Hmm.
And I've seen it, I've read a number of things, in association that if you've been dabbling in exorcisms and demonic encounters, that you should cross water, so
Hmm.
that it cannot follow you. At the same time, um, you know, the lore associated with the bridge, the old bridge, and then the newer bridge, near Devil's Promenade is the devil will meet you at the center of the bridge,
Mm-hmm.
which sort of
Or at
negates.
least you will hear his horses run across. Yes.
Yes, which is lore that is uh, still in play at Silver Dollar City and the old part, which I love. So that seems to negate the whole, not being able to cross running water.
Well, I mean, I think the devil has his own place, and uh, he also is at Crossroads. If you want to look at Crossroads lore, uh,
Yeah,
you know,
it is. It
famous
is.
the famous story of Robert Johnson selling his soul to play the guitar. He
Yeah,
met the devil at the crossroads. Well, um, a river is a crossroads.
it is. It is.
So
And in multiple dimensions.
yes, that's true. Now, by the same token, there are those who say that witches can't cross flowing river,
Hmm.
um, and also that they can't go through a slanted window. I'm not really sure where, and it's in New England. You have witches' windows,
Oh,
mainly I think in up New Hampshire and through there. If you look at dormers and everything, you'll have uh, windows that are slanted, and the lore is the witches can't go through those windows.
mm, that is interesting.
Hmm.
Now, so I can never go very long without wanting to tie something back into Celtic mythology. And and maybe this will tie in, or perhaps it won't. Um, the the great creation origin of Celtic mythology is the union. It really begins with Danu, the Celtic goddess,
Hmm.
and I do love the fact that Celtic mythology, while it may have gotten a bit corrupted with Greco-Roman mythology at various times, it has a different feel to it.
Yeah.
And you could say that the two original gods, Danu and the Dagda,
Mhm.
are would be the equivalent of the Greek Titans, but they are, because they're the origin gods that are not terribly involved with the rest of the mythology. It's the idea that things trace their lineage back to this ancient point, and they are recognized as having consciousness, obviously, and purpose, and intent, but they once they have done their thing, they simply imbued the world with their essence.
Mhm.
And but unlike the Titans, we don't see the the conflict between the Titans and the new gods led by Zeus. And so
Zeus
the
was just
new,
was just at odds with everybody, though.
yeah, that's true. That's true. If, the height of Greco-Roman myth would be very romantic if it wasn't incredibly creepy. Um, and so where we're talking
Really
about Zeus,
horror story.
I know. Oh my guys. Oh yeah. So I mean, realistically, there's this a sign over the door that leads to Zeus that says non-consensual. Um, the, everything that you really need to know about Zeus, that's where it begins. That's where it ends.
Yeah.
But Danu, is the origin water goddess of Celtic mythology. She is water,
Mhm.
and there's a beautiful origin myth that speaks of the barrenness of existence until there is suddenly the introduction of the sacred water, and through that, the sacred water gives life, interestingly enough, to the first acorn, and the first acorn grows into into a great oak. It would be similar. It's essentially the Celtic tree of life, or um, the Celtic Yggdrasil of Norse mythology. But in this case, the tree itself is the sentient All Father,
Mhm.
and and that and that tree, which is sentient, it is the great Father God, is called the Dagda, and
Mhm.
so the reverence for the water in the forest all tie their lineage to Danu and the Dagda, which I think is a beautiful, beautiful creation story.
It really is. I
And
mean, it really is.
it 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 ties such evocation into, what really, from a sort of an energetic plane of on the earth gives us life, which is the forest and the water.
Hmm. Well, and I mean, there are creation stories of the Cato speaking peoples of the Ozarks related to the waters of the Hot Springs Valley, and
Yes.
so including I forget the name of the tribe it was supposed to be that they uh, they journeyed into one of the mountains through a spring, and
Mhm.
they disappeared, and the mountain closed up behind them, and they are there, and it's almost like a sort of a Middle Earth kind of story that they're still there living, uh,
Oh, I love
all
that.
Tolkien uh, hints of Tolkien in there.
Yeah.
And so you have that kind of origin stories there, as well as I just find it very interesting that and they refer to the area as the Valley of the Vapors for the hot springs, and
Yes.
it was it was considered so sacred that everyone put aside their differences, even if you were at war, that
Yes.
everyone was safe in the valley.
Yes. And that, of course, we're talking about Hot Springs, Arkansas. It's in the Ouachita Mountain Range, but from certainly a near adjacent geological perspective, as well as a cultural perspective, it is it is our mountain culture.
It is, and for the native tribes of the Ozarks, they would gather there once a year. So
Yeah.
the the tribes that lived much further north would travel there, and so though their origin stories and their view of the springs was very much the early views in the Ozarks, and there's
Yes.
uh, some indication that the springs, Eureka Springs, were viewed the same way.
Yes, as a truce site, as
Yeah.
a place of healing. Interesting, the waters of the Ozarks have, especially in the more rugged areas of the Ozarks Mountains and the Ouachitas, the water itself has been associated with healing.
With healing and and as you said, as truce sites. I mean, basically Switzerland of the Ozarks.
Yes, yes, and we haven't talked about this for a while, but Eureka Springs is actually at times referred to as the little Switzerland of the Ozarks. Um,
True.
more for its architecture and its topography.
Yeah.
On the mountainside, it's a tiny Victorian village on the sides of two opposing mountains, and with a very certainly a very unique sort of insular subculture, but
Mhm.
also a very unique energy to that space.
Yes. And I think that's pretty much the case of all the springs, you know. Um, and uh, one of the early uh, explorations of some of the springs in the southern part of Arkansas Ozarks were actually the Quapaw Indians, who then migrated further north, and
Hmm.
so that may be part of where that came into other places as they came north. Perhaps those views of the springs came with them. I don't know.
It might be. It's. I wanna to land on Eureka Springs for a moment. Probably just because it's been forever since I've been down there, and I want to go back. It's really not that far away from me, about 40
Yeah.
miles. Um, we've talked about this in the past, but it, something that is very noticeable about Eureka Springs, obviously, is the amount of flowing water that's there.
Hmm.
There's and it does. How would you describe the energy or the feeling in Eureka Springs?
In a way, it's almost sort of what a place out of time, you know, in its own bubble. I do think that has something to do with the water. It's very much same kind of feeling you often get along the Mississippi or along the Missouri
Mm,
River. Um, that it's a space of its own, and it just makes you aware of the bigger expanse.
yeah, yeah, I agree. Something that, and of course, this is one of those things. It falls into that you can't prove it one way or the other. But something that is very odd for me is I'm going to preface this by saying I typically have a very strong sense of direction, and B, within the downtown Eureka Springs area, my sense of direction turns 180 degrees.
I don't know that mine gets that disoriented, but it does seem to. I have had times where I had to stop and think
Hmm.
what direction I'm going in, and normally, you know, I know exactly. Okay, there's north or whatever, no matter where I'm
Yeah,
at.
yeah.
Um, it
The
is one
the
of like that. Sometimes I kind of stop and think.
mhm. The and a number of people are, and I see the memes on social media that you know don't tell me north or south, tell me left at the Sonic, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. And you and I both plot our courses by the compass,
Hmm.
in the sense that there's north, south, east, and west, and very rarely do we not know which direction those are. And
Right.
so, for myself, I'm only speaking for myself, but when I move into a space that I lose that sense, it is, or can be, especially if I'm not prepared for it, it can be really disconcerting.
It is. It makes me uncomfortable because it's kind of, for me, it's kind of like knowing which way's up. I know which way's
Yes.
up, and so
Yes.
my brain is like, what do you mean? I'm not sure which way is north or south or east or west.
Yes. Yes.
The
And
computer doesn't like it.
yeah, it I I've been down to Eureka Springs because I love the town. I've been down to Eureka Springs enough to know, which way I need to do various things, and all that kind of thing. But if I set my rational mind aside and just said, okay, which way is north, I would point south.
Yeah,
And
I
that
kind of
that
that way
is
a bit too there.
that's very odd. Very odd.
And I
The
kind of wonder if there's something with the EMF field or something that
Hmm.
a little off from other places around. I don't know.
Or possibly ley lines.
Well, that's true. And to be perfectly honest, I was thinking about this earlier before we got started. Different people will say, well, are there ley lines in the area? And perfect, certainly for me, I think it's underground water.
That
Where
makes sense.
people tend to think that there are ley lines in the Ozarks, you will typically find an underground river.
That makes sense. That makes sense. This was a bit of a non sequitur, but great book that I have on um, British ancient British dragon lore, because one always has a book on that, and and referencing the ley lines as the paths, the paths that the dragons would fly.
Hmm.
So in reality, the dragons just might be following the underground rivers.
Could very well be. I think maybe we can kind of wind up. Let's talk for just a minute about something that people probably are not aware of, and that is the Great Arkansas Pearl Rush.
Yes, which also impacted Missouri.
Yes.
Yeah, the extent of which, until I did some quick reading this afternoon, was not aware. I was aware of the exploitation of the natural or indigenous river mussel population of the White River.
Hmm. But this is the reason why for it. Yeah.
Yes, yes, and certainly in today's era, we do not associate uh, pearls, specifically like high end, very expensive pearls, with 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 the fresh waterways of North America, but that was not always the case.
No, and it really started in the 1850s with someone finding a freshwater pearl in a river in New Jersey and selling it to Tiffany and Company in New York for $1,500, which would be about $50,000 today for one freshwater pearl. And
Yes,
so people started looking for pearls in rivers across the country, and the White River had a lot.
yes,
And they did find some valuable pearls, but then additionally, a fashion trend started of mother of pearl buttons. And so
yes.
they would use the mussel shells
Hmm.
uh, for mother of pearl, and they took out barge loads of mussels from the
Yeah,
White River.
they did, and I I hesitate to say this because it is paradoxical and unfortunate. I'm very much for all natural products, and I'm certainly very much for products made in the United States. At the same time, in this turn of the century, we saw a situation where um, vast exploitation of an all natural product that was certainly made in the United States, and helped foster a comparatively short-lived industry here, in my backyard,
Yeah.
the White River Valley, really had um, uh, poor sustainability. Was really no sustainability, and some very negative consequences with essentially over harvest, that but really fascinating. And instead of cheap plastic, um, uh, imported from a foreign country, and mass produced in a sweatshop somewhere,
Right.
the buttons of the the late 19th and early 20th century was mother of pearl, and in many cases, certainly considering the amount that was exported from the White River Valley, I would hazard a guess that in perhaps most cases, the buttons on men's shirts and women's dresses across the United States came from the White River mussels.
Exactly. And in fact, I've got a jar of buttons somewhere that were my grandmother's, and a lot of them are mother of pearl. Now I've seen her today. I'm wondering how many of them came from the White River.
Yeah. Yes. And unfortunately, I need to repost this article. Speaking of articles, we really should repost your story, Allegiances, underneath this video when we get it archived. I want to do that.
Yeah, you can do.
But back in May of 2014, I had the opportunity to write an article on State of the Ozarks about indigenous river mussels,
Mhm.
and very, very fascinating, very technical. My biggest personal challenge, or I suppose editorial challenge, was writing something that was properly accurate. That was accurate to the life cycle of multiple species of river mussel, and 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 it is fascinating. At the same time, most of the river mussels, or the lake water mussels that we're familiar with, is the zebra mussel, which is an invasive species
Yeah.
that obviously has a really bad name because it is a very problematic invasive species.
Well,
But the
in fact, I think the indigenous water mussels are like the second most endangered species in America, or something like that.
Yes, they are. And interestingly enough, one of the pushes to replace a lot of our rural Ozarks low water bridges with actual bridges is something that is hoped will help, because within the river system, for example, so and we're talking spring branches, some pretty shallow small creeks and waterways that, for example, the spawning beds of the indigenous river mussels could be here, and then there's a bridge that blocks the water flow, a low water bridge that blocks the water flow. But then for example, like the fertilization area or the reproduction area would be further down, or vice versa.
Oh, okay.
And so the low water bridges block, basically, not basically, really cut the life cycle process of a river mussel in half.
Oh, wow. And you would never think, you don't think about those things, but that's
No.
interesting.
And the low water bridges have been in place probably since at least the 1920s.
Hmm.
And we, it's very easy for me to think of the low water bridges as being more traditionalist and having less of an impact on the environment, having been there forever and ever. And then they tear those out and they put in a new bridge, and I'm sitting there going, I miss the low water bridge. But the that reminds me, I got to tell a really funny story. But the idea that the more modern actual bridge could be helping sustain some of these really endangered species in a
Hmm.
positive way. And my funny story was going on a bit of a field trip with Curtis, with the Hillcrofters Society, and we're on 65. There was an accident on Highway 65, and so we turned one ridge early to get down into the Bull Creek area, and there was an out of state. Um, it was an out of state older couple driving a very, very small, very expensive sports car, tiny little European sports car. And we were turning off to get into the Bull Creek community to go do research at various locations. And they were turning off just to try to avoid the backstop traffic. And so there's a number of winding, the blacktop winds down the side of the ridge. And one of the things I love about the Highway 65 corridor between Springfield and Branson, it looks so urban, and
it does anymore.
and you just get a little ways off of that, and that sense of being in modern society rather evaporates in many cases. And so we wander down over the side, and then there's an increasing number of indigenous vehicles to go along with the experience for our out-of-state tourists. And then the blacktop ends, and then we're on gravel. Of course, that road gets down into the Bull Shoals bottoms and then turns to dirt. And then we've got the forest encroaching with the tree branches growing over, and there are no greater ditches. And finally we get down. What's that?
And probably a little red clay too.
Oh yeah. And as we're going there, we're behind them, and they're getting slower and slower and slower. And finally we come to Bull Creek, and the low water crossing for Bull Creek. Bull Creek is pretty wide in through there, and it's a low water bridge all the way across. And at this particular juncture point with where the water level was, the water was over all of it. And that's where they stopped. And they sat there for a few minutes, and then they turned around and headed back to the traffic. And of course, we were in Curtis's SUV, and then just we crossed the low water bridge and went up on the other side, and then wandered around, ended up by Chadwick, and in the Chadwick Conservation Area, the Mark Twain National Forest, and lots of cool exploring that day.
I have a funny low water bridge story too.
Yes.
Because there's one that the road that goes through our farm. There used to be a low water bridge there, and my dad, as well as the neighbor, had cattle, so and it was all on our land, but so we'd have to maintain a water gap. And for anyone that doesn't know what a water gap is with a low water bridge, is you put fencing up, and you have a float so that the fencing will float up when the water comes up, so it can go hopefully through the can or over the bridge, depending on how much water there is. So you have to maintain that. So it's one spring, the water's up and the water gap's out, and my dad's down there working on it. He's in waders, and the neighbor, who was about 90 at the time, and this is the same fellow that when we were on Instagram, and I said he grew up on the property with the spring that the farmers would stop at. Well, he was born there. Now he was literally, Roch's throw away where he lived. And so he's standing there talking to my dad while my dad's working on the water gap, and hearing him tell it, because he, grew up here the whole time, but he had this really low drawl that you'd think he was from Southern Arkansas. And he said he was standing on the bridge talking, my dad's working, and he looks up and he sees a water moccasin coming floating on the water, because the water's pretty fast. And he said, I was just saying, hey, watch out, when the water moccasin went in the wader. And to hear him tell it, he'd just say, I'm not sure who came out of that boot first.
I don't blame your dad. Oh my gosh. And
My
And
dad, my dad's version of it was a little more colorful that I can't really share on my stream.
oh, so true. And for people who might not be familiar, water moccasin is a cottonmouth.
Yes.
Is
It's-
Agkistrodon Pisces, I think. One of the most venomous snake species, or one of the most dangerous snake species in the Ozarks.
Yes, I think fortunately that day the snake was just trying to ride the wave, and he was trying to get out just as quick as my dad, so
Yes.
no one got bit.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Although I think
Yeah.
my dad just about had a heart attack. So
And the water moccasin is a water snake.
yes,
That's the
it
name.
is. Yes, it is.
Oh, good times. Which of course is a good point for a public service announcement. Be cautious around snakes in the Ozarks. Um, Try not to kill them, especially without proper identification in terms of what they are, because there's a lot of good snake species, and in fact, a number of snake species like the king snake that is your best bet for not having copperheads around.
Yes.
And so, there's it's important to know what it is that you're dealing with across the board. But at the same time, as we are fast approaching the dog days of summer, when snakes start to molt and shed their skin, they become easily agitated. They oftentimes, as they molt, they cannot see very well, which
Hmm.
makes them even more easily agitated. That our venomous snake species for about the next 6 to 8 weeks are at their most dangerous.
Yes. So usually keep a wide berth, and to be honest, most people when they do kill a snake, they kill a beneficial snake. So
Mhm. Of which there's typically more of them in
yeah,
most cases,
yeah.
and unless you're in Chadwick. Uh, there's so many copperheads out there in those Chadwick Hills, it ain't even funny.
Yeah, just watch where you step.
I know, I know. It. I remember my family up in Midwest. My mom in particular was like, I would never move down to the Ozarks because where I come from, the indigenous venomous snake species would really be the timber rattler, and there's almost none left.
Yeah,
So if we had a problematic snake, it was going to be a bull snake or a bull snake pair that
yeah,
was after chicken eggs and that kind of thing. Very, very different experience than having cottonmouths and copperheads, plus timber rattlers. Quick PSA: the pygmy rattlers are out as well, so
yeah.
they're cute. And nobody said that the Ozarks were an easy place to live, but that doesn't mean that they're not beautiful.
And it makes it more interesting.
Yes, it does.
Well, we appreciate everybody, and if you have topics you're interested in, let us know.
Yes,
Otherwise, you just
please.
have to listen to what we like. So
No, dealer's choice, but we love hearing from folks and love getting ideas and research topics and sometimes just really, really wonderful resource leads.
really do, and people following the page are awesome, and keep it coming, and we'll be back here next Wednesday.
Yes, absolutely. Looking forward to it. And Lisa, looking forward to seeing you guys on Saturday.
Us too. Night, everybody.
Night, everybody.